Good morning, everyone. Very excited to be with you today, and very excited you could be with us. I think we're going to have some fun this morning talking about a wide range of topics, like Michelle said. So really going to be focusing on a historical timeline of autism and things, how they've developed throughout the years, looking at theories and causes of autism, looking at environmental and biological events that have occurred, cultural views within the autism community and maybe some outside of the autism community, social economic impact of the disorder on the families, on our systems, and on our public, myths, fads, and controversies of some of the current treatments that are available for autism. Legislation and legal issues that are going on, very important as we try to create effective services, and a lot of advocacy issues and things that we should be focusing on to try to get funding and services for. So today we want to make sure that you can come out of the webinar today with really good key components of the history of autism, again, understanding some of the myths and fads of treatments and why they're considered a fad, and identify some strategies around legislation and advocacy efforts that you can do and help your families do, so we can get better services and treatment for individuals on the spectrum. So let's start with our historical timeline. Many of you are probably pretty familiar with some of the history of autism, so we're not going to go through every one of these, but it's important that we understand where we've come from so we can move forward. And we know that back in 1911, when this was first, the autism term was first coined, it wasn't until 1940 then, at that point, where unfortunately the term refrigerator mothers came about. And so there was a lot of time in between there. And, you know, this was where we felt that moms were cold, weren't loving and social with the infant, and hence they developed the disorder. And just an incredible hit to a family and to a mother, and unfortunately that stayed with us for 2 decades. So you can see how it really stifled any kind of advancements, what people thought of the disorder, and for 2 decades that occurred. And then came along Dr. Leo Kanner, who published the article Autistic Contact. And you know, this is where his description of what autism was, you know, really widely recognized until we came into the 80s. And we had Hans Asperger's, who was the pediatrician who talked a little bit more about autism and the 4 boys that he saw, that he worked with, and understanding better the characteristics of what we know to be Asperger's syndrome today. But then in 1948, when Congress passed legislation to help support, you couldn't discriminate against people with disabilities, and that was a large impact. So when you think about 1948 and how far we've come as a society, that's not that long ago before we had a discrimination law. 1952, we kind of got in the DSM, where we put our disorders, mental health disorders and so forth. The 1963 Disability Act was big, that people needed to have access to work and vocational opportunities the same as a person without a disability. And of course, in 64, when Dr. Rimland came about with his book, Infantile Autism. Of course, Dr. Rimland had a son with autism. And he was the first one who finally came out to say, wait a minute, this is not a disorder that's brought upon because of a mother's lack of caring and mothering and social. So thank goodness that occurred and there. And then in 65, CBS did a very large story about a boy with autism featuring Dr. Dr. Lovas's work and so forth. This was a very public awareness, and it was probably the most public knowledge that they had received on what autism was and the development of what the disorder was and the impact. In 65 came about the National Society of Autistic Children, which later became the Autism Society, and they ended up building libraries and gathering information and really helping the government see the impact of the disorder. There was a study in 66 in England that said only 0.04% of children had autism. And unfortunately, it'd be another 14 years before we got any statistical data on prevalences after that.